Moving to New York City is stressful. You were probably so worried about the move. And on top of that, you're worried about making mistakes when you actually move to New York City. I get it. I felt the exact same way when moving to New York City. What are some of these mistakes that you need to avoid when moving to New York City? I'm gonna go over those with you in this video. As a New York City real estate agent, I help people move to New York City every single day. And of course, I've done it myself. One of my top pieces of advice that I give to people when moving to New York City is don't spend too much on a New York City apartment. Now, why do I say this? The funny part is, I actually make more money the more somebody spends on an apartment. But I still say this to people, and that's because I think that when you're first moving to New York City, you should spend less on an apartment because you're not going to be spending a ton of time in your New York City apartment. You're most likely going to be out most nights and meeting new people and doing different things. So why spend all of this money on an apartment that you don't plan on living in New York City? Now, I do have to say, if you have a budget where you can kind of choose which neighborhood that you're moving to, then sometimes you might have to spend a little bit more to live in one neighborhood over another, but weigh the pros and cons with price when moving to one neighborhood versus another neighborhood, because sometimes it just doesn't make sense to spend a ton of money on rent when you're not even gonna hardly be in your apartment. There's tons of people that pick the wrong neighborhood to move to in New York City just because they know somebody or heard online that this neighborhood was a good neighborhood to move to. A lot of times people follow certain influencers or people and they recommend certain neighborhoods to them, or they live in that neighborhood. And therefore, the person following them and moving to New York City thinks that they're gonna love the neighborhood too. Picking a New York City neighborhood to move to is a very, very personal decision. And a lot of times what one person loves, another person might despise. So I always say to do as much research as you can about the New York City neighborhood that you're about to move to. And even better, if you can spend time in that neighborhood in person, even at different times of the day, so say in the morning, at night, just to see the vibe of that neighborhood at all different times, that would be best, because there are so many times where somebody loves a neighborhood during the day, but then at night they don't love it at all, or vice versa. So you need to be able to see the neighborhood in person if you can, and see if you like the vibe of the neighborhood at all different times of the day. This is so, so important. And there's actually been neighborhoods that I lived in New York City where I wish I did this more because I loved it at one time of day, but then didn't love it so much at others. And I could have avoided that by just spending more time in the neighborhood at all different times. I know that sometimes this is easier said than done, especially if you're not moving from a place where you can get to New York City easily. But if you can do this, I would advise it. If you can't really spend a lot of time in New York City before moving there, then I would advise just asking questions as much as you can about that specific neighborhood online. There are so many great Facebook communities where you can ask questions about New York City neighborhoods and just New York City as a whole. Reddit has so many great threads about this as well, where people are really just giving their actual advice. And try to get that advice from different people just so you can see what different people are saying. Another mistake I want you to avoid is signing a lease with a sketchy landlord. Now, it's really, really hard to know if you're signing with a sketchy landlord in advance. I actually have another video that is going over signs of how to find a sketchy landlord. I'll try to link it up at some point in this video so that you can then watch that video so you avoid this by all costs, because I'm not saying that all landlords are bad, because they're definitely not. Most landlords are good, and as a real estate agent, I deal with landlords every day, but there are some bad apples that just ruin it for everybody else. So I want you to know the signs of how to avoid one of these bad landlords. Sometimes people move to a new New York City apartment and they instantly break the rental rules when moving to that New York City apartment, kind of start the relationship off on a bad foot. So what do I mean by rental rules? Say if you're not allowed to have pets in your New York City apartment and then you have a pet. Say if you try to do something to your apartment that you're not allowed to do to your apartment, like you're trying to kind of like fix it up or like give it a little renovation or something like that. Some people do things right away that they're not supposed to do in their apartment. And then either they get caught, they can get fined, or they just have a really, really bad relationship with their landlord because of this. And this is something that I would advise to avoid as much as possible. Another moving mistake I want you to avoid is try to avoid moving at prime time when rents are the highest. So when are rents highest on a month-to-month basis in New York City? Typically the nicer months in New York City, rents are going to be higher. Rents tend to be high anywhere from July and September. And the reason why is because typically around that time of year, you just have a whole new group of people moving into New York City, especially people who are straight out of college or grad programs or things like that. So that time of year tends to be higher. Even May sometimes has a spike. It does vary from year to year. Now, if you move from December to February, that time of year, you tend to get your best deals. Now, I know it's very, very hard to time out your move, depending on your work situation or when you can just actually move to New York City. But if you can, try to move in the colder months because you're most likely going to get a better rental deal. And why is it important to get a rental deal? Say if you move in August to New York City, most of the time you're going to do a yearly lease, and then that lease is going to be up again in August. So if you choose to move to another apartment at that time, you're then going to be looking again for an apartment in August. First, if you chose to move in December, then your lease is going to be up the next December. And if you choose to move then, you'll be moving in December every year. So sometimes people get caught in a really, really bad cycle where they're moving during the hottest month of the year, every 2 years, however often they move. And try to avoid that as much as you can because you don't want to get caught in that cycle. I've gotten caught in that cycle before and it's not fun. So these are just some things that I want you to avoid when moving to New York City. Now, I would love to know if you've already moved to New York City or if you just started the process, is there any mistakes that you could think of that I missed in this video? As always, I just love hearing from you guys.